Hello, everyone. I'm Gabriel Nascimento, professor at Federal University of Southern Bahia, Brazil, Universidade Federal do Sul da Bahia. It's a pleasure to me to be here with Ethos Pears from the City University of New York. Ethel, I was mentioning last time we got together, we met. It was like to talk about issues concerning our conversation. So it's a pleasure finally to finally be here with you to have this conversation with you. And I'm nervous as a Brazilian linguist to be here. And I'd like to thank you, ALAB, for the opportunity to be here for this series. That's a very important series in Brazil with applied linguists. We had participations with many linguists such as Sinfrey Marconi, or Brazilian linguists, black and activists from Brazil. And now we're here with Professor Ethos Peres. Let me just start by introducing Professor Ethos Peres, who's presidential professor at the City University of New York, as I mentioned. He's affiliated with two units of the CUNY, which is the City College and Anthropology Department, and the Graduate Center, where he's in both the linguistics and the anthropology programs. His PhD in linguistics was earned at the University of California, San Diego, from Northwestern University, and he received an MA in linguistics from Johns Hopkins University School and of Advanced International Studies. Okay, and Professor Arthur Spears also earned a BA with a triple major in French, Spanish, and political science from the University of Kansas. His research spans linguistic anthropology, what we're going to talk about a lot about here, sociolinguistics, Pidgin Creoles, language contact, grammatical analysis, race and ethnicity, education, and ideology. So, languages that he specializes are African American English, Haitian Creole, or many other languages such as French-related Creole languages. He works in four languages, or includes Portuguese. So feel free to talk in Portuguese if you want, Professor Arthur. With English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. His publications are very many publications, but are very important to our field. Which includes, I'm not going to mention all the publications here, but which includes some articles, some works and books. For example, that one co-edited or with Di Paolo, Mariana Di Paolo, which language and dialects in the U.S. focus on diversity and linguistics, uh, or Black language in the English-speaking Caribbean and the United States, history, use, and education, or some publications which are recent. So, as example, we have Black language in the English-speaking Caribbean, as I mentioned, but also let me check here just a moment. Okay, with Geneva Smitherman, Anita Ball, and Sinfrey Marconi, Black linguistics. So, thank you very much, Professor Atu, first of all, for accepting the invitation to be here with us. And my first question to you specifically concerns how do you see applied linguistics nowadays?
Applied linguistics nowadays. Well, shall I repeat some of the points that we were talking about a little bit earlier? Um, One of the things is I think we should go beyond the topics that people usually talk about and the topics that research is usually funded for and that are valorized in career actions like the granting of tenure and promotion to higher professorial ranks. Um, The other thing, looking at questions of race, which I've done a lot of, we should attack the idea of white as norm. This comes up, for example, given some things I've been reading recently, in automatic speech recognition for computers. And the devices and algorithms are attuned to primarily the speech of whites. And they're difficult for those who speak other varieties of English, for example, African American English, particularly the vernacular versions of it. They're more difficult for them to work with. So how do we democratize, for example, technology such as automatic speech recognition? That's one issue, in addition to the first. The third thing is the need for more studies of actual grammar structure. Because in grammar, we find ideology, and more specifically, racial ideologies and other kinds of ideologies. And this is a point I've made in several publications. I haven't really hit it in one publication, but I've made it a part of several publications. But it's something that I would like to do more of, and I would like to spread the idea that is something that we can work on and find out a lot about. If you want to return to this, I can certainly talk about it more. I'd also like to see, and this is the next point, more work on ideology. Ideology as a notion has sort of fallen from favor in the social sciences. But I think, as most scholars would agree, if they were backed into a corner, ideology is a notion that we absolutely need for discussion of societies, both in an historical sense and in a general dynamic sense. What is the evolution of societies and different forms of governance going on? And what I said before relates directly to this. We need to attend to theory and praxis as related to reform, revolt, and other large-scale social actions. This is something that many applied linguistics would never think about or prefer not to think about, and I'm being very candid here. This relates back to the questions of funding from government and other agencies, and also career decisions, for example, tenure and promotion. The next point has to do with incorporating lived experience into theory. As we live, the problems that we can use in our research, or as a focus of our research, pop up everywhere. I've talked about language as self-defense in negotiating establishment institutions or institutions of power. Language in dealing with the police, for example, in self-defense. Also courts of law and medicine, and dealing with all kinds of professional encounters. Now, the last point I want to stress is how important ethnographic analysis is. For example, the ethnographic analysis of professional situations, as has been done with aviation, and I'll come back and just say 2 words about that example. And in connection with that ethnographic analysis, preparing materials and curricula can then be used and incorporated into training of professionals. The aviation example relates to research that's been published on how those in the pilot cabin during flights communicate with each other. And in this particular case, I hate to single out one particular country, but it was noted that with Venezuelan flights, there was a high number of crashes in relation to those with other crews. That communication framework that you find in the cabins, airplane cabins, was investigated ethnographically, what I'm pushing here, and they found out that there was a kind of discourse structure and hierarchization of the pilot, the co pilot, etc., that led to a sometimes fatal rigidity in terms of the actions that were taken and whether the plane got into trouble and perhaps eventually crashed. Similar studies have been done with other uh, nationality related pilot situations, but perhaps the most serious one had to do with the study that was done with Venezuelan pilots. And of course, that relates to national culture and other aspects of what's going on in that area. The last point, which I already said, is that taking that ethnographic analysis and then going ahead with it to prepare materials and curricula and then incorporate the materials and curricula, into training those professionals. So those are some major wide points that I want to stress and lay out. And of course, I've concentrated on issues that most applied linguistics, those who consider themselves applied linguists, and others have pushed into the background or left in the background, I should say.
Okay, thank you. Your point on language as self-defense brings to for our discussion here. Uh, for example, very important points to how African Americans and Black Brazilians, because we're speaking from Brazil now, ALAB, which is our Applied Linguistic Association. I didn't mention that in English. The point that uh, we have the point that make the point that African Americans reacted, or they could have resistance in terms of language, and use it language as self defense. For example, for how do African Americans use English? So it connects, of course, to the way you see applied linguistics, because, of course, we had trainings, or we had fields in linguistics, in general linguistics specifically, putting subjects as oppressed, but sometimes not reflecting on the way they resisted. And your work, your scholarship connects all the moments. Of course, this is an inspiration to us applied linguistics, or from the global south and from elsewhere. Your scholarship reflects how we can see practices coming from Black people all over the world, but specifically we're talking about Brazil and the US here, and how they resisted and they resist with language as self-defense to face white supremacy. So my second question goes around white supremacy. That's the point you've been publishing and writing a lot. So I read three or four papers that you wrote recently. One of them, we could work together because you edited one of my papers, and I thank you for the generosity and all the words you deployed around the comments. They were very good to my work specifically. So For you, what's the widening power of language in current days when we have far right governments? For example, you had in the US, but now we have in Brazil, or uprising movements, for example, in Europe. And has white supremacy gained new momentum into new fashions to you with the use of the power of language?
Mhm. Well, let me make a basic point that's directly related to your point, but I want to bring in a sub point, and that concerns what I said about race and discussing white supremacy. Everybody of any socially constructed racial identity, including whites, blacks, browns, purples, greens, and yellows, everybody has to take white supremacy seriously. And all insights that we get from the study of it help everybody. Why is that so? Because white supremacy is the major structure, a major structure that makes possible, that makes possible the oppression and exploitation of all non elite peoples. And I want to say that again. White supremacy is the major, or a major at least, structure that makes possible the exploitation of all people, no matter what their racial background. So when we talk about the problems with white supremacy, everybody should listen because it affects you, unless you're a member of the ruling, global ruling elites, or your national ruling elites. And as we know, there are a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of these populations. So it affects everybody. Also, remember that white supremacy is an ideology. It's a set of ideas designed, designed and disseminated for the purpose of exploitation and control and the maintenance of vested interest. Okay, did that come through clearly? I hate to talk about basics, but I know you like basics, Gabriel. Um, that's what an ideology is, and I use the term in its critical sense. Now, see, here's a language issue that applied linguistics can come in and clarify. It's very interesting that ideology in American or US political discourse has almost exclusively come to mean any set of ideas. But the term has, throughout the great majority of its history, been a critical term. It's about specific kinds of ideas, those used to exploit and control and maintain the vested interest of the elite, the political and economic elite. You really can't separate them at the end of the day. So we have to keep that in mind. It's not just white supremacy as an ideology that we need to be concerned about, but also all the other ideologies. For example, those that support extreme social stratification and, what's the big word? Inequality. Inequality, which is a nice word. And I know you like nice words. I'm just kidding here. Inequality is simply a nice word for exploitation, oppression, policing, and torture, not to mention incarceration. I'll talk about nice things another day, but I'll talk about reality today.
Sure. So
Okay.
I love when you say nice words because Sometimes inequality replace it's the word people use to not use racism. And is that the same in the US for you?
Say that once more.
Yeah, sometimes people don't like to say racism, and they don't say there is racism and here in Brazil, and they say there is social inequality.
Well, it's a very useful word. And my point of view is that useful words should be used.
Sure, sure.
So it exists, it's real, it's a problem, it should be studied. So let's use the word. It's efficient in talking about racial issues.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay, that's great. So to me, what comes to my mind now is that when you talk about white supremacy, as you argued, we can see white supremacy in norms, in grammars, in the way you or in the US or we in Brazil try to normatize languages, try to use languages or patterns in terms of what languages are, like national identities through the nationalistic bias. Uh, you, of course, are bringing about white supremacy in the U.S., and this is a conversation, a very good conversation to connect white supremacy in the U.S. to white supremacy in Brazil. We didn't have Jim Crow laws in Brazil, but I know you know a lot about Brazil. You
Might be
know,
good to give one or two examples of Jim Crow laws in Brazil. Are you talking about the present or the past in Brazil?
yes, we didn't have officially Jim Crow laws in Brazil,
Mhm.
but we can see situated forms of what you had in terms of Jim Crow laws. For example, the way the
Crow
cities,
practices, yeah.
yeah, practices of this, yes, and sometimes it's more sophisticated. So, what I want to provoke even more in our conversation is that you also claim that racism is even more systemic than institutional. What I can, of course, read through other eyes, such as, for example, Bonilla Silva, many scholars in Brazil as well, but I can see Bonilla Silva in the US. And it's thought provoking that this was also put for many black scholars. And you say this transcends, it's more than systemic in your work, uh, which was, I think, the introduction to the issue in Anthropological Linguistics Journal. But you said that it transcends human life. This was also put for many black scholars as Aimé Césaire, while the century in humanism and as Bureau, or Fanon. Do you take a stand critically on this discussion against humanism and the way humanism and European humanism has put challenges or obstacles against black communities? For example, through from Fanon's point that we have a humanism that's the point that dehumanizes, but I don't know how to say this because in Portuguese is more than dehumanize. How do you see humanism and how the humanism reclaims a central role on how language ideologies create the human in institutions and language to you?
Well, Gabriel, you're asking your questions in a way that make me have to tell the truth.
Please, that's your turn.
Unvarnished, unvarnished, without decoration. Um, First of all, I think we have to say bluntly that humanism in the Western tradition, the Enlightenment, etc., were for white people. As long as we get clear about the group that those concepts, those theories were related to, then we can start understanding it much better. But the basic point is humanism, the Enlightenment, were created with white people in mind. Okay, so now we can be clear. Black people were left out. Other people of color were left out. Indigenous peoples were left out of all of that. So, in terms of many people thinking today, they both were failures in that sense. Others might say at least they were a start. If you develop those concepts for whites, then perhaps they can be expanded to include other peoples. That's a point for debate. But going back to your notion about systemic white supremacy or systemic racism as opposed to institutionalized, I'll make an historical point and then I'll come to the present. When I first started reading Fanon and others like him, and in the books that were written in the, say, late 60s, mostly in the 70s, and then after that, the term generally used was institutional racism, not systemic racism. I have come to believe, and I think many other people have come to believe, because system is used much, much more nowadays, is that the term system says more than the term institutional. Institutional refers to institutions which are human, and they have their dynamics. And of course, human institutions affect our lives in a huge way. But institution doesn't say as much as system. Because if we talk about white supremacy as a system, then what are we talking about? We're talking about institutions, of course. But system brings in explicitly the notion of all the parts within this system and all of the rules for the existence and evolution of the system. It brings to the forefront the notion of interaction and dynamism. Because whenever we talk about systems, unless it's something written down on paper, we're talking about dynamism. There's constant interaction, and that constant interaction produces change. And then we talk about the evolution of the system. And then we can think about the evolution of white supremacy. We can never attack or defeat white supremacy unless we know very well how it works. The other thing about system is that every time we talk about system, we talk about how the system interacts with its environment. Not only its constituent parts, but also its environment. So the term system makes that explicit. And so that's why we prefer system. So as I said in that article in the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology, even rivers are caught up in white supremacy. And I talked about my great-grandmother who had been hurled into the Chattahoochee River after she was tortured and chased for giving birth to my grandfather, who was a white man's son. And apparently the white man's wife was so jealous that she's the one who instigated the torture and death of my great-grandmother. And we have to talk about those things. The history of white supremacy is littered with violence and torture, and there's no reason for us to hide them unless we're being overly nice. Sometimes to get at the truth, we have to be blunt and direct.
Yes, that story about your grandmother connects to
Great
my,
mother. Great
yes,
mother. Uh-huh.
grandmother. Sorry, so
Uh-huh.
grandmother
Uh-huh.
connects to my familiar stories of my grandfather, who told my mother stories of freed slave of his family.
Mhm.
And of course, this talks about the next question. I'm going to be very now trying to compel or to go to try to check next questions because of time countdown specifically here. But because some aspects and some conceptualizations from your work are very interesting for thought-provoking questions here. For example, when you term uh, racism and currently as, for example, in the US, as US capitalist chattel slavery, what to me specifically differs this kind of racism and of slavery, specifically slavery, from that kind of slavery that occurred in pre-colonial times. So, for our listeners now, for people who are here with us, how do you define this capitalist chattel slavery?
Mhm. Well, let me talk about it just very briefly. Uh, Rather than, I'll characterize it rather than offering a strict definition. But of course, the key terms are capitalist and chattel. We have to back up and we have to say that there have been different kinds of slavery throughout history. The Anglo Saxons, the Portuguese, and others want to say that their slavery was not as harsh as some other forms. Here in the US, which had the most advanced form of capitalist chattel slavery, people often say, well, slavery is slavery, implying that, oh, slavery has been with us since the dawn of humankind. Uh, Slavery is slavery wherever you have found it. Now, scholars who have studied slavery have found that there are different types of slavery. Of course, there are. There was a type of slavery little people ever think about, industrial slavery. There were slaves in industry. Okay. Can you imagine the big factory? There were slaves who were among the workers in industry. So, how could that work? It presents something of a conceptual problem, but that conceptual problem has been responded to, and that's why industrial slavery is so interesting. There were different types of slavery. So, that point gets at that we need to name the particular type that we're talking about when we talk about slavery to be clear. Chattel, of course, means slaves were treated as items to be sold in markets like any other commodity. So that gets at the commodity aspect of slavery, chattel. In many other types of slavery, slaves were basically household slaves and or they were connected to a particular family across generations. At a certain point, they might start marrying into their slaveholders' families and eventually become free and part of the clan of the slaveholders. Did that happen in the US South? No, never. We're talking about different kinds of slavery. So
Yes.
that slavery that we're talking about, which is often talked about under the rubric or the heading of old world slavery, And then we can oppose that to New World slavery. So capitalist chattel slavery is a type of New World slavery, particularly evidence in what's called the New World. I often prefer to say the Western Hemisphere, but some people like to say the New World.
Mhm.
Now, capitalists, it reached its highest point, slavery, in capitalism. In other words, we can go back and say, how did this particular form of slavery develop? It developed in tandem with, in conjunction with capitalism. Okay, the chattel part of it developed in connection with capitalism, so it was inherently capitalist. Of course, we had slavery before capitalism. People define capitalism in different ways, but capitalism, as most modern social scientists talk about it, and historians, is a modern phenomenon, meaning roughly after the 1400s. So that's what I'm getting at in specifying that we're talking about capitalist chattel slavery. And one minor thing is in when people say, oh, they had slavery in West Africa and Central Africa too. Well, we have to say, as social scientists and historians, yes, they had slavery, of course, but that was a different kind of slavery. Theirs had not developed into capitalist slavery or chattel slavery. Now, many things are a question of degree. I'm sure slaves were sold in West and Central Africa, but not where you had a system of markets and marketing
Mhm.
for the sale of these commodities called slaves. So, does that pretty much respond to your question?
Yes, and of course, that was very great from you talking about how com- um, the slaves were themselves commodities, and of course you go back to the plantations. That's the connection we have between Brazil and the U.S. in terms of how you deployed. Of course, the United States deployed that system from the old plantations to what we can call the becoming black of the world through capitalism and through this agenda of new liberal times. And of course, now I want to talk about linguistics specifically because uh, your inspiring work, what I can see now in the 60s, as we've been told and we read, many sociolinguists, specifically white, uh, whose take was influential to quantitative sociolinguistics. That's in Brazil, we term variationist sociolinguistics,
Mm-hmm.
tried to demonstrate publicly that many of the assumptions on Black childhood, for example, and mostly involving language use, were racist because some of those assumptions assumed that Black children, for example, didn't have coherence in
Mm-hmm.
their speaking. Okay. It seems that with you and many sociolinguists, anthropological linguists, or particularly black ones that I'm going to bring for our discussion now, talking African American communicative practices, I would also include Geneva Smideman, that's influential to our work, I think, that you've been recuperating as influential, of course. Sam Allen, that descends from your work. So you have a lot of you've been generating a lot of linguists devising aspects from your work. Uh, Among others, of course, became more than an attempt. So these black linguists uh, tried to not respond to white supremacy and the racist bias from psycholinguistics, for example. So, of course, this is what I read now from this scholarship. Yes, it's my reading, my personal reading. But what do you expect personally and as a linguist from young sociolinguists now and in the future developments on Black communities?
Okay, and you say sociolinguistics in the quantitative sense when you ask that
Now,
question?
I presuppose that you're not going to talk about on quantitative sense, but
Okay,
also qualitative or many aspects concerning our sociolinguistics.
yeah. Well, what I do is sociolinguistics, uh, which I see basically, and most linguists would admit, sociolinguistics is the study of language in its social cultural context. And when we say social and cultural, that includes politics, economics, white supremacy, inequality. Those are all part of the social and cultural context. So that's how I see social linguistics. Uh, and of course, my biggest complaint is that we don't take the tools that we have and focus sufficiently on hardcore issues and problems in the world today. So that's it. And the points I made at the beginning are all getting at the idea there's a whole lot more that we could be doing, dealing with really difficult problems. And I always stress the reality that a lot of research is influenced by where you can find funding. So essentially, money and the institutions and people that control money are influencing research. And here's the biggest problem that, at least in the US, is happening more and more and more and more. I've gotten very little funding for my research and never expected to get much funding. And as I said, I think in my last article or one of the last ones, I was able to write what I have written because I was in a department that did not require heavy outside funding. So, as fate would have it, I was very lucky. I didn't have to get big grants. And related to that, I have to talk about unintelligibility. Unintelligibility. I'm just seeing the translators putting the captions up. I'd like to see. I think I know how they would translate it, but
That's how your work sounds. Sometimes we read these words like you create at a level that's so fast, like this.
that it refers to. Let me give a concrete example. I, for a while, when I was an assistant professor, would submit grant proposals. And I have to say, and I'm not being immodest or anything, I write well. I'm able to explain things well on paper. I've never had a problem with that. Nevertheless, I would write grant proposals and I would get back reviews saying, I can't understand this research project. I don't understand what will result from this research project. It's obvious. It's right in the grant proposal. What do I expect to do? Why? The significance of it, how the work will proceed, and the expected outcomes. That's all stated. That's what you put in a proposal. Any idiot can do that. But yet, unintelligibility in the sense I'm talking about is a refusal, basically, to understand so that you don't have to deal with ideas or lines of research that are not familiar or not appreciated, one or the other. So that's what unintelligibility is about. So I was able to get around the unintelligibility trap because I was, by luck, in a department that did not require significant outside funding. Okay. In other words, research is highly politicized because it's highly monetized. That could be a nice little chant for some demonstration. Research is highly politicized because it's highly monetized. Research is highly politicized, and so on and so forth.
And very expensive as well.
Yeah, and some forms of research are expensive. And note how expensive and how time consuming research can be. And sometimes the significance of that research isn't very high, at least not in my opinion, and in the opinion of some of my colleagues. So I'll ask you, does that answer your question that you put before me? Mm-hmm. Okay. So,
What do you expect from young scholars on sociolinguistics, for example, in the future developments concerning, for example, Black communities? Because I'm very interested to the way you work with Black communities, how you see Black communities in terms of interaction, how they connect the bodies into languages. So, what do you expect for future developments in our field?
it's hard to say in terms of Black language specifically. I will say this. I do ethnography 24 hours a day because I live, and I have for almost 70% of my life, I have lived in a multi class Black community. Okay, where I grew up under segregation, where I live now in Harlem, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
So, in that sense, I'm doing ethnography 24 hours a day because I'm in the middle of it. I don't have to go to my research site.
Yes,
Every hour of the day, I'm in my research site.
this is ethnography here.
I'm not looking for anything, but I'm confronted with things every day, all day long. And many of them I don't even have time to pursue. And I don't. But there's so many topics that I could have pursued that I simply didn't have time to. This is to say, sometimes I wonder if I could have still been able to write the things I have written without living in the community.
Mm.
Because, as you know, of course, ethnographies, you go there for what, a month, 6 months, a year, and then you leave to write up what you think or understand that you saw. It could be mostly right or it could be mostly wrong,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And so, again, the question is, could I have written what I've written without living ethnography, and also being a participant observer who is also a member observer. Not only a participant observer, but a member. I'm doing the ethnography, I'm participating in the community, but I'm also a member of the community.
Yes.
I'm talking about a different level of embedding for the researcher. And I throw that question out. Maybe you don't have to be a member living in the community full time to come up with certain things. But for better or worse, I think you do have to be a member living full time in the community to see and understand certain aspects of what's going on there with language and with issues and problems that go beyond language. Do I have a recommendation? I wouldn't offer a recommendation now, but I simply want to make the point. There's
Please.
ethnography, and then there is ethnography. You know.
Okay, that's nice because to me it's very funny in the moment you say I do not have a recommendation because you're not here to normatize, but you you're here for inspiration. This is good. Okay, but now I'm going to work through the points because now I have the power of the interviewer. The interviewer has a power here. I want to listen to certain points that when I'm reading your work, those points are very important to me to reconnect to some of the aspects of course, Afro-Brazilian linguistic practices, and in your case, African American linguistic practices. You've been focusing on African American linguistic practices. You specialize in specifically, you talk about many aspects from Haiti Creoles, most of times trying to analyze how Haitian Creoles or African American language use developed aspects of creation, what you sometimes call augmentation. Try to. My question now is about some aspects that connect your work to uh, uh, some other discussions led by linguists such as Sinfrey Marconi, Alastair Pennycook, and others that have situated this question as gazing at the colonial times, where colonizers set the traditions through their eyes in invaded communities in Africa. For example, all the languages we have names now are colonial names. So those are colonial names we use to name our languages. So secondly, more recently, even sociolinguistics has experimented breakthrough while resetting the place, or I could say setting the place of interaction more centrally to classical aspects of sociolinguistics. For example, what I mean, it includes your work when you bring macro and micro terms for African American linguistic practices, because you observe centrally some micro and macro terms. And to me, it seems that linguistics, I'm not speaking about general linguistics here, especially this linguistics we are in now. So we do is being directed towards problematizing the framework on the speech community. In
Mhm.
Brazil specifically, it seems sometimes that I'm not speaking about everyone. Of course, I'm not trying to make this issue generally, But of course, it seems that sometimes we are very concerned. So you read my point on in anthropological linguistics journal. It seems that we're trying to define a nationalistic language identity of language prior to define or to analyze speech communities. So it's about speech communities, my question. So, as I said, in Brazil, we have white communities, for example, who prefer the uses of European Portuguese, but they use aspects of Black Portuguese. And with this thing in mind, this attempt to provoke you for further into this debate, how do you see Black communities in the U.S. in their influences to the formation of what we call English world Englishes? Why am I am questioning this? Why to question a question like this? Because sometimes to me it seems that when we talk about world Englishes, we are ignoring, and now of course I'm drawing on Geneva's minimum point. We ignoring uh, the ignoring black communities in the US, black speech communities in the US, and we are normatizing into global Englishes what is white based. Do you agree with this? And how do you see this connection? How do you see the formation of this English, this world Englishes or global English with contributions from African Americans?
Okay, I think Smitherman and others have made a really important point. When the term world English is used, in everything I can think of offhand, it's really talking about standard or hegemonic Englishes within various countries around the world. So it's not following at all a Marconi and Pennycook model. They talk about the invention and disinvention of languages. And what they're really getting at, and this is crucial, is the historic attempt by Western linguists to delimit and confine and to make controllable the languages around the world and to establish boundaries where there are no boundaries or pick representative varieties of a language in a particular territory which are not representative. You following what I'm saying? So we have to keep in mind all the time that language variation is horizontal across space, it's vertical, following stratification of all kinds within a particular space, and it's also, what's the best way to put this? Full of registers. So once you get it down to a variety of a particularly vertical and horizontal space, you still have to talk about registers. So it's even more complex. Now, it's absolutely impossible to delimit all of those points of research. So essentially, what we do is we pretend that there is a thing that is delimited, and it's that thing that we're researching. I would say we don't yet have the tools to deal with the fluidity of language from any perspective. For example, setting up the boundaries of this language versus that language, or detailing how registers of one person's speech, even getting it down to the individual, let alone the community, but how the registers of just one individual interact with each other and whether they really have boundaries. The question you asked exposes, I know you don't like to expose, but your question exposes how complex language really is. And we just have to accept that we don't have the tools to confront crucial questions. I think we're getting much better at it. The study of variation in language was a huge advance. It actually tackled a crucial area of language complexity and made it possible for us to start dealing with it. So I'm always hopeful, but at the same time, we have to realize what our toolkit is right now and what it is that we don't know. I had someone who was very interested in asking me to define African American English. And I said, well, I can't give you a definition that will last for all times, but I can give you my working definition that I use in my own research. See, I'm making it very specific. I can give you the definition of African American English that I use in my own research. Okay, it's very
Only.
explicit. But I would never say that it is the definition of African American English. So that's what I would put on the table now. And of course, if you want to follow up on anything, by all means, do.
Yes. In fact, I specifically can see reading your work and why you tag those practices that the English that we have here in Brazil, in Latin America, or elsewhere is the English spoken by white communities in the US.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, this is important. But now, for the follow up, I think our time is coming to an end. But I'm going. I cannot see messages here coming from Professor Branca. So let's feel free to continue. When you bring African American speech communities into question to address how racism and socio-politically is faced, how African Americans face racism. And to me, that's how I read it. You address certain aspects or interesting aspects, I could say, on how it can occur. For example, when you talk about re-semanticized words, where I love so much because it's a classical work you sent by email, I think. It was the first work that you sent me to read. It's a nice work for talking about uh, this aspect of re-semanticized words, as it's the case of the so-called obscenity that you mentioned. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so for example, nigga, that's sometimes mentioned like an N word in the US. Some people say it's an N word. For example, if I submit an article or a paper, and I used to translate from Portuguese to English. Black in Portuguese you say negro to negro in English. For of course the publishing will not allow me to publish because of the use of negro because of N word. But when you bring nigga into the context after a long-standing debate in the U.S., We both have met, and our conversation began because I wrote a paper. I told you I wrote a paper in this direction without reading yours, would be very supportive to my work back then because some of the questions we are talking here were very important back then.
Mm,
But in Brazil, my country, and where I come from, where I speak from now, negro, not negro, has been a central term for describing black and brown populations, communities
mm,
descending from Africans and marked by racism.
mhm,
And although in the past it served for marking black communities with what I call a tattoo of inferiority, I'm also reading your work through the same aspects as put by Henry Louis Gates Jr. as black signifying. So my question is, you use this framework to say that black, if I'm, of course, if I'm sure, please correct me if I'm not, it's not right, but that black communities in the US act up to neutralize certain racist words. Of course, they continue racist through the framework of white community and white supremacy. Of course, we cannot interrupt white supremacy, but use language for self-defense. And uh, how do you see black communities in the US as acting up to neutralize certain racist words that will continue racist, but will be also neutralized by black communities? How do you see black communities now in the US doing
yeah.
this?
Let me say that some of those words that I was talking about have always been neutral, and others you can see the historical process of their being neutralized in the black community. So sometimes there's a conscious or subconscious neutralization process. And other times, as far as we know, the words have been neutral since the beginning. Now, let's take the word, the N word, nigga, and I'll just say it. I don't think we have to be on our toes. Um, as far as we can tell, and certainly as far as I can tell, it has always been neutral. And by neutral, I mean that it can be used in an evaluatively negative, neutral, or positive sense. That's what I mean by neutral. It is not inherently negative, neutral, or positive because it is neutral. And it is the speech context and the speaker and hearer that make it neutral, negative, or positive in a particular speech situation. So I wanted to clarify what I mean by neutral and neutralized. Okay. So to get back to the word nigga, it is not inherently negative. It's not inherently positive. It's not inherently neutral. But it can be used in all three of those ways to talk about it that way. Okay. So that's what I'm getting at. Now, there are clear cases where words have been neutralized. There was a conscious process to destigmatize them, to defang them. And the best example of that in the African American community is the word black, which is usually translated as negro. Um, as I like to remind people who didn't grow up as long ago as I did, I I will ask them, what was the absolute worst thing that you could call an African American in 1950? What's the absolute worst thing you could call an African American in 1950? Okay, it wasn't nigger, because as I've written, it has always been neutral. So what was the term? Black. If you really wanted to affect somebody and try to hurt them to the core of their being, you called them black. What happened? During the civil rights movement, there was a sub-movement, I like to call it, called Black is Beautiful. That was a sub-movement of the civil rights movement. And it was decided we're going to defang the word black, and we're going to make it positive. Black is beautiful. I'm black and I'm beautiful. I'm black and I have good hair. My wonderful, good, marvelous, nappy black hair. There was a conscious effort to defang it, to neutralize it. And that's exactly what happened. It took. And I think it's an incredibly interesting instance of where political consciousness takes a word and makes it the opposite of what it was in connotation before. Other words, I believe, have been negativized. They've been made negative. And one of those words is bitch, is used for women. It has been neutralized in many Black communities. And I believe that neutral use in Black communities has spread to white communities. So we hear white women using bitch neutrally. Yeah, bitch, you're my best friend. You know, that's a positive use. So, and as I said, neutral means it doesn't have any inherent evaluation attached to it. So, let me ask if that answers your question.
Yeah, I love the answer. Yes, it's perfect. It connects at all to Brazil in the context of black here in Brazil, the same as preto, dark black, because when
Is
you
that
read
a nice term, preto?
preto, yes,
That's
preto.
good.
Preto was a term that I assume as central, and that's now been over time. We have changes of uses. For example, in Bahia, my state. So our time ended completely. So I would like to thank you for your inspiring words. This absolutely nice conversation we had. It's a it's a great work that's led by ALAB, our Brazilian Applied Linguistics Association, and it's our final moment. You are ending a series of interviews, so thank you for accepting it. Thank you for being with us. Thank you, Professor Branca, who's leading it, and thank you, you who were with us in this conversation. So see you next time.
Okay, and thank you for inviting me to do this. I've enjoyed it tremendously.
I love when we have these conversations. Like hours and hours having this conversation would be a pleasure. Thank you so much, Professor Arthur. Thank you, Branca. Thank you all. Good night.
Okay, bye bye.